I'm Frederick. They told me this in a whisper. Now, you'll hear it. Enjoy watching. The sky above the city was grey, with low clouds hanging over the rooftops like a warning. Cold drops of rain trickled slowly down the windows as, in a small apartment on the 5th floor, a black woman in her late 20s, with a sharp, stubborn gaze and precise movements, finished tying a knot in a silk scarf. Maya Johnson, a name that would go down in history from today on. A name that was about to be heard in a courtroom full of people thirsty for truth, or blood, or maybe both. She didn't let herself be nervous, not for a second, because she knew that in this city, if you were a woman, if you were black, if you weren't afraid to be loud and confident, you had no right to be weak. On the table in front of her was a carefully packed folder, the case that had rocked the county, a young white cop who had shot a teenager in the back, unarmed, in front of witnesses. The cameras were rolling. There was video. But even with such obviousness, the trial promised to be a meat grinder. The local authorities did not want a scandal. Colleagues in the prosecutor's office, no matter how you look at it, whispered, maybe it would be better to come to an agreement. She was not going to. This was her moment, her choice, her truth. She put on a jacket, deep cherry colour, strict cut, but with character, like herself. On the nails, a neutral tone. On the face, only thin eyeliner and gloss. Nothing extra, nothing provocative. But not trying to please. She looked in the mirror. Before her stood a woman who had achieved everything without connections, without an influential family name, without the right accents in her voice. She went through Harvard, won 9 cases in a row, withstood persecution, insults, setups, and now she was going to where the law should prevail. On the way to the courthouse, there was no chaos in her head. Only one thing. Do it. Show what you are capable of. For all those who were not heard. The car stopped at the entrance. The driver glanced over his shoulder. He knew who she was. He had heard that the city was talking about this case. He had seen the videos. He even muttered something, like, good luck. But she was already out. The wet asphalt reflected the sky, like a mirror broken in trembling puddles. Journalists had already gathered in front of the courthouse. Cameras, people with signs. Someone was shouting something about justice. Someone, about how the cop was just defending himself. Everything was as always. Maya did not look at anyone. She walked firmly, heel to toe, holding her briefcase like a shield. People parted, although no one yet knew who she was. To most, she looked like someone. Maybe like the mother of the deceased. Maybe like the girlfriend of the accused. But not like a prosecutor. Not like a figure of the law. Not like a representative of the authorities. And frankly, that was the whole point. She did not look like she should. And that pissed them all off. The receptionist at the entrance immediately looked away. The second guard, a white man in his 50s, his cap pulled down almost over his nose, stood right at the metal detector as she approached. You can't come in here, he said wearily, but with that special note that said, I know who you are, and you're nobody here. She showed her badge. He didn't even look. The press aisle is over there, he added, taking a step forward. She didn't move. He looked at her as if he were the problem, not the state's attorney. I'm the attorney, she said clearly, but calmly. He frowned. There was a long, drawn-out second. Our attorney is a man, he muttered, and made a motion with his hand, as if shooing her away. Behind him, someone was already laughing. The camera, mounted on a tripod in the corner, caught the moment. Then the footage would be cut. Later, someone would say it was a misunderstanding, but at that moment, it was not a mistake. It was a system, the one that hates, fears, and rejects. She still didn't move. Her breathing remained even, but her hands clenched tighter. She showed her ID again. The same answer. I said, get out, or I'll call the police. The iron in his voice was false, but convincing. She took a step back, slowly, looking him straight in the eyes, as if to say, you just signed your own death warrant. He didn't get it, or didn't want to, but the moment was captured. People started turning around. A woman holding a child, a man in a grey coat, someone's assistant with a laptop. No one intervened. No one said, "Hey, it's the prosecutor." Everyone was silent, because it was a familiar ritual. Too familiar. She was pushed through the door, and only then did she lower her eyes for the first time. Not out of shame, out of rage. In a few seconds, the judge was due to leave the courtroom. The secretary had already climbed the steps. The case file was still in her hands. There was a mark from the guard's fingers on it. A mark that she would leave. In the protocol. In memory. In the place where revenge is born. Not from anger, but from truth. She did not know then that panic had already begun behind the door. That the judge's assistant was looking for her with his eyes. That someone had already realized what exactly they had done. What they had destroyed. But she knew, the moment she entered, not asking, not begging, but demanding, they would remember this morning. Every drop of rain, every look, every second in which they thought they could treat her like this. And this morning of the winner would become their defeat. She paused for a moment on the steps leading up to the front entrance of the county courthouse. A massive, oppressive building with columns that looked less like a temple of law than a mausoleum where justice had long been buried. The stone was slippery under her feet, and each step echoed through her body like a warning. Watch your step, Maya. You are going where the color of your skin will speak for you more than your words. She straightened up, raised her head, and continued walking. A bright burgundy jacket with sharp shoulders, heavy silver hoop earrings, tight black trousers. Everything on her looked bold, confident, not what was expected of her. Dreadlocks, neatly pulled up into a high hairstyle, emphasized the neck and the seriousness of her gaze. Her look was a statement. I will not pretend to be comfortable in order to be heard. And it was this appearance that became her death before she even crossed the threshold. There were 3 guards standing at the top of the stairs by the entrance, and only one of them, a young Latino, nodded slightly, as if he recognized her. The other 2, both white, one with a belly hanging out of his belt, the other with small eyes and a mouth permanently distorted by a contemptuous smile, instantly became wary. The small mouth narrowed, assessing her like an object. "The press is there," he said, not even waiting for her to say anything. "I'm the prosecutor," she said calmly, but there was already steel in her voice. "Oh, come on," said the fat one, and they both laughed. The laughter was not loud. It was what is called a social marker, when you laugh so that the other person understands where he belongs. "Do you have an ID?" asked the second, not with interest, but with malice. She slowly pulled out a leather ID, opened it, and turned it towards them. He did not even look. "The photo is strange. Are you sure that is you?" Maya was silent. He continued. "We had a cleaning lady here yesterday, also with hair like that, also all important, until she caught the rag." More laughter. A passing white man in a suit glanced at the stage, raised an eyebrow as if to intervene, but then quickly turned away. It was too familiar, and too uncomfortable. "Step away from the entrance," the guard said, stepping forward. He kept his hand near his holster, not on his weapon, but close. "I'm the lead prosecutor in Shepherd versus State," Maya said firmly. "The trial starts in 20 minutes. You're delaying justice." "Oh, come on," he smirked again. "You're kind of too cocky to be an assistant prosecutor or a witness. Are you on the defendant's side, perhaps?" Her fists clenched, but her face remained calm. She knew that any emotion would be interpreted as aggression, any protest as hysteria, any attempt at resistance as a threat. And she knew. They were waiting for this. They were hoping that she would flare up, that she would start screaming. Then they would have a reason. Then they could act. One of them had already taken out a walkie-talkie and pressed the button. The second began to call for additional troops, supposedly to calm the troublemaker. The troublemaker. She stood calmly, but her eyes were burning. To humiliate, to denigrate, to not let her in. It was important for them, not just to put her in her place. It was important for them to believe that she did not belong here, that she could not be a prosecutor, that she could not be someone who was respected. People began to gather behind her, not on purpose. It was just a place where everyone lingered before entering the court. Some with coffee, some with documents, some just looking for shade, but now they were all looking only at her. The whispers began to spread like mold. What did she do? Isn't that the one in the video yesterday? I thought the prosecutor was a man. And then one of the guards came closer to her and said quietly, but loud enough for the others to hear, "You don't have to look at me like that. We've already seen you yelling about your rights. Now you're going to shut up. They'll let you in if you say thank you." Loud enough. Someone in the crowd chuckled. Someone laughed. A young white woman in a formal suit walked past without looking. One of the senior lawyers even took out his phone as if he wanted to film the moment, or just capture her face for later. It was a public trampling, a theatre of power, a demonstration that Maya's place was not where decisions were made, but where she was told to stand. It all lasted only a minute, maybe two, but every second cut into her flesh like a blade, and all this against a backdrop of marble, bronze plaques about the rule of law, and the state flag fluttering above the entrance. And then she took a step. One. Small, but sure. Right up the step. The guard stepped back. She pulled out her badge again, slowly, calmly, raised it higher, this time toward one of the cameras, and she said, "My name is Maya Johnson. I represent the prosecution. The hearing begins in 16 minutes. The entrance was blocked by security without legal basis. Any further action would be considered obstruction of justice and racial discrimination. Silence fell on the courtroom floor. The smiles disappeared. The laughter died down. Because now the moment was part of the record. The camera clicked. Someone was recording. Someone was already forwarding it. And all of this was not a scream, not hysteria, not a scandal, but an even voice, the pure truth. And then, what she expected happened. One of the guards said, "Let her through. Let her go." And that was it. No apologies, no explanation. As if none of this had happened. As if she had not been humiliated, tested, mocked. As if her dignity was something she could tuck behind her back, while people pretended nothing happened. She walked past without turning around, without smiling. Not with relief, but with heaviness. Because she knew, this is not the end. This is only the entrance, and it will be worse inside. Colder, thinner, harder. Because everyone who saw her being stopped will now pretend they didn't see. Everyone who could have intervened kept quiet. Everyone who whispered will now keep quiet louder. And it is this silence that is more dangerous than any words. She walked through the metal detector. It beeped. On purpose. One of the guards brought the scanner up, almost touching her body. The other looked, not hiding his disgust. "The scissors are probably in the bag," someone said. She said nothing. She just held the folder tighter. The papers inside are a weapon that doesn't beep, but hurts more. When she crossed the threshold of the courtroom, hundreds of eyes met her. Some were surprised, some were tense, some were empty, but all of them, without exception, saw before them not a prosecutor, but a woman. A black woman. Too proud, too bold, too different, and precisely because of that, dangerous. Before we continue, let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you ever had moments in your life similar to what we are talking about? Your opinions and experiences are very important to us. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. Maya took another step, walking through a corridor with marble tiles and high ceilings that echoed with her footsteps. The courtroom was already behind the wall, and her steps were becoming more confident. She felt the gazes on her again. At first, they were worried. Then, clearly assessing. Here, in the courthouse, where her face and figure should have been familiar, she was not given a single glance of sympathy. She was not welcome here. She was a stranger to them, and this feeling was familiar, like a cold wind blowing in your face. Familiar and painful. Maya did not look at the people, did not look at those who were watching her, did not look at the judges, did not even look at the doors of the courtroom. She held her head high and walked as if this was her last day, her last chance. This was her battle. But, as in any battle, her opponents were already waiting for her. And that moment came when she approached a group of bailiffs standing at the door. They were talking among themselves. Someone was writing something in a notebook. Someone was crumpling a piece of paper in their hands. All this was happening as if she were not a prosecutor, but just a random passerby. When she came closer, one of the bailiffs, a young man with a displeased expression on his face, immediately looked at her. "Your pass," he said, without even smiling. His voice was harsh, sharp, as if he had decided in advance that her place was not where it should have been. His eyes slid over her figure, stopped at her earrings, dreadlocks, at the way she moved. He saw her not as an employee, not as a lawyer, but as something alien, ridiculous in this place. "I am a prosecutor," Maya said calmly, as if repeating words that should have been said a long time ago. "I know who you are," he replied, not meeting her gaze, continuing to study the folder in his hands. "But you still need to show a pass to get in." Maya handed over her ID and calmly showed her documents, but he didn't look at them. He didn't even try to verify her words in her place. He looked at the ID and immediately handed it back, with a disdainful look. "This isn't for you. The defendants come through a different entrance," he said, as if making a conclusion. He wasn't going to listen to her answer at all. "You're mistaken," Maya said, realizing that this was another moment when her dignity would be crumpled and thrown onto the floor. But she couldn't give up. Everything she had done so far had led her to this very moment, when all the strength she had gathered over the years had to be presented right in his face. She clenched her fists, but didn't show it. "I'm not a defendant," she said firmly, looking him in the eyes. "I'm the lead prosecutor in Shepherd versus State." The man sighed, as if she shouldn't remind him of his mistake. He exchanged a glance with his colleague, who stood a little further away. He took the badge again, and this time his gaze was more intent, but still uncomprehending. He still hadn't realized that this was not just a man in front of him, but someone who determined destinies. He looked at her, and then looked away again. "So you must have mixed up the entrance," he muttered. His voice was becoming sarcastic again, as if he were wondering how she had ended up here. He didn't see her, didn't notice her. All he saw was his confidence, which Maya should surely understand and accept. Maya didn't break her gaze. She knew that this was her moment, the moment when her patience and composure would be decisive, because this moment wasn't just about her being let in. This was the moment when her right to a seat here, in this court, was in question. And this was more than just an administrative error. This was another humiliation, hidden under the guise of a misunderstanding. She couldn't let it go there. But her eyes, her presence, her body, which was supposed to symbolize authority and law, didn't matter to these people. In their eyes, she was nothing more than an extra figure. The man handed her the ID again, as if it were just a piece of paper that she was supposed to accept with an apology. He didn't apologize, and there was no doubt in his eyes that he was not mistaken. He was sure, and she was an outsider. And it wasn't just irritation. It was a racial bias he didn't realize was there, on the surface, hidden beneath his demeanor. "Go through the front door," he said, now with a hint of mockery in his voice that clearly hinted at her place. She looked at him, feeling a lump in her throat. It was a moment when she felt invisible to them, when she was a black woman who didn't fit their standards and roles, when she couldn't be right. Her place was somewhere else, in the crowd, among the accused, among those on trial. He didn't want to see her. He didn't want to accept her. And she knew her path would be difficult, not just because of the case, but because she was a woman and a black woman. It was a moment of humiliation, even if he didn't realize it. Maya didn't take a single step back. She looked at him, her eyes unwavering. But in that moment, her face remained unreadable. She took the badge. She turned and walked toward the front door, as was her duty. But her body felt the weight of that humiliation. She knew this was just the beginning, and she wasn't going to give up. She belonged here, and she would prove it. She hadn't taken more than a few steps when she felt herself being pushed from behind. Not harshly, not aggressively, but with precisely that intention to show her her place. Following that, like a cherished warning, The guard's voice rang out, still full of confidence and contempt. "You're going the wrong way," he said with obvious anguish, trying not to miss a moment of his superiority. Maya turned around abruptly. Her face froze for a moment, but she said nothing. Her eyes remained cold, although something in her soul began to crack, like ice on a river. Everything around her began to crumble. She stood before him, not knowing what to do with this furious, unbearably painful feeling, this feeling of being driven into a corner. The guard pushed her again, a little harder this time, and all she could do was step back, feeling how her legs were barely holding on in place. She was about to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "Where are you going, Black One?" someone muttered from behind her, his voice in a tone that could only be heard here, in this building. She felt heat spreading through her body. It felt like she was literally being pushed out of what should have been her place, to where she deserved to be. She couldn't help but notice how the others were looking at her with amazement and open curiosity. Several people standing in the corridor immediately turned their heads. A woman in an expensive coat raised her head, a man in a formal suit with a hint of cynicism on his face. One of the journalists even clicked a camera, and the light, like a mark, hit Maya's face. All this was happening here, in an open corridor, in the very heart of the court. All that was left was to wait for someone to decide how many more times she would be humiliated in front of everyone. At that moment, she felt her body again frozen in the desire not to retreat, the understanding that she couldn't leave, couldn't give up everything she had, her job, her mission. And all this against the backdrop of laughter, against the backdrop of indignation, of undisguised contempt. One of the lawyers behind him, also a middle-aged man with a tired look, turned and looked at her with an expression as if in his eyes Maya was not a woman, but some strange, unacceptable element that should not have been here. And just like the guard, he glanced at her as if it were something impersonal. In those moments, it seemed to her that time had stopped. The bright lights in the hallway, the faded carpets under her feet, the people whispering, and the gaze of each of them examining her, condemning her. There was a feeling in the air. She was not a prosecutor anymore. She had no right to be here now. She was here only because she was different from them. Her skin color, her hair, her mannerisms, they all made her feel out of place in this building. And they all knew it, and they all showed it. Look at that one," someone in the crowd whispered, holding up a file. He made no attempt to hide the mockery in his voice. Maya couldn't see him, but she could hear his words cutting through her, as if they had crossed over to another, more intimate level. A level where she could be humiliated in front of everyone. "Black people shouldn't be here," the woman next to her said, disdain in her voice. She hunched over, and Maya felt her words land with a heavy thud, as if they had hit her right in the chest. It hurt, but it was familiar. It wasn't a new humiliation, but an echo from the past. Humiliating her, it was just part of an ordinary day. She could feel her breathing getting heavier. Every breath she took was a struggle against what they were trying to force upon her, but she couldn't back down. At one point, as the crowd continued to whisper, she heard giggles. People standing to the side were giggling among themselves, not trying to hide their joy at the fact that Maya was the object of their ridicule. And it was truly terrifying, not so much because of what she was feeling in that moment, but because of how normal it was for everyone around her. Some of the journalists standing nearby were capturing the moment, recording footage as if this was the important moment of the day. For them, this wasn't just humiliation. This was a performance in which she was not an actor, but an extra. At that moment, she felt her eyes fill with tears, but she gritted her teeth and accepted them as good shots for their story. A story in which she had no place except in the video of a black woman being thrown out of a courtroom. It hurt. It hurt because every look, every gesture, every laugh, they pointed to her exclusion, to her inability to belong. And Maya knew that she couldn't let herself break. She couldn't let them see how their words hurt her. Maya stood like a rock, but inside she was shaking. She knew that this wasn't the end, that this was only the beginning of what she would have to endure. But her body was strong, and it held. She took a step, one more step, and despite the laughter and the contempt, she kept moving forward. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let them take her place. Here, in this room, she was a prosecutor. And no one, even if they laughed and despised her, could take that away. Maya walked down the hallway so fast that her footsteps echoed in the empty room. Her heart was beating fast, but she tried to remain calm. If only they knew how difficult it was. She glanced at the guards and their hard, assessing looks, and tried again to focus on what was important. The case she was handling was far more important than her personal dignity. But then, before she could reach the door of the courtroom, a bailiff appeared in front of her. He stood in the doorway, looking at her as if she were not just a woman, but some kind of uninvited guest who had come to the wrong place. He did not say a word, simply stood in her way, blocking the passage. She stopped and looked at him, not trying to hide her irritation. He was tall, with a hard expression, and the same cold, contemptuous gaze that she knew so well. "Let me through," Maya said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm the lead prosecutor on the Shepherd case. This is my place." He didn't move. "I said let me through," she repeated, a little more forcefully. But he only narrowed his eyes and said curtly, as if he hadn't heard her at all, "You have no right to be here." "I have every right to be here. I'm the prosecutor," Maya said forcefully. But he continued to stand there, as if ignoring her words. There was no doubt in his eyes. All he saw was the colour of her skin and her out-of-place presence here, in this building. She shouldn't be here, in his opinion. But she should be here, and she wasn't going to back down. She felt her body tense, but at the same time, a wave of anger was building in her chest. He remained silent. Only now his body was tense, his arms crossed over his chest, as if preparing to use force. Maya didn't take a single step back. "You are disturbing the process," he said finally, almost with pleasure, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Your presence here is disturbing the order." Maya stood, listening to his words, and her body tightened, as if she had felt a blow. For a moment, it seemed to her that they would lock her here forever, and they would be able to leave her outside this process as an insignificant person who did not deserve the right to be there. She tried not to show that it hurt her, but the guard's words tormented her from the inside. She was the main one in this process. She was the one who made sure that the law prevailed, and his words meant one thing. She was an alien here. She was no longer a prosecutor, but a person who could be treated as an obstacle. "I am not disturbing the order," she said, but her voice no longer had the confidence it had before. "I am telling the truth, and you know it. This is my job." "I said that you are disturbing the order," the bailiff repeated with obvious mockery. And then, as soon as his words were out of his mouth, another guard approached her. He was younger, but his expression was nothing but mockery and hidden disdain. He glanced at her face, noticing how hers had flushed with irritation. But that glance did nothing. Maya couldn't and wouldn't give up, but her struggle was becoming more and more exhausting. They didn't stop. He continued, ignoring her words. "We're just going to ask you to leave," he said, as if it were part of their daily routine. "A prosecutor in your understanding shouldn't look like you. He shouldn't be a woman with hair like that. He shouldn't be like you." "I'm not one to give in," Maya said firmly, her chest expanding even as her insides began to twist. "I know who I am, and I don't need your approval." "Maybe you should think about it for a minute," the guard said with a smirk, ignoring her protests. "Why don't you go back to where you're used to, where you'll be more comfortable?" And then his words, mocking and cruel, finally found an echo. They were all listening, and Maya noticed someone in the audience nearby laugh. Someone else watching her struggle giggled. Someone whispered, "Yeah, she shouldn't be here." It was all happening in front of those around her, in this hallway, among the lawyers, the journalists, the court workers. For a moment, Maya felt it all become real. She didn't belong here. Her face was too dark. Her body was too wrong. She clenched her fists and said with complete confidence, "You can't throw me out of here. I have a right to be here." She felt her words echoing in the hallway, but no one responded. Even the guards holding back said nothing. They stood there, looking at her, and her presence felt increasingly wrong, unnecessary. She felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just their right to humiliate her here, in this place. It was the norm, and if she continued to resist, they could drag her out of here by force. It was scary, but she couldn't leave. She couldn't let herself leave. She raised her head and looked at them. "I won't leave. I don't need your permission. And let everyone hear it. Let everyone see it. I'll stand here. And they know it's true." She stayed where she was, unable to contain the tension, but not giving in. They couldn't defeat her. She stayed, and in that moment, her presence in the room became significant. Her fight became significant. Despite the ridicule, despite the humiliation, despite their contempt. Before we continue, let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you ever had moments in your life similar to what we're talking about? Your experiences are important to us, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. At that moment, when everything around him began to unfold with even greater aggression, his eyes were motionless. He stood near the wall, almost invisible, hidden in the shadow of the large colonnade, which served not only as an architectural detail, but also reflected his place in this building. He was invisible, his presence was unnoticeable, but his gaze did not leave the place where the humiliation was taking place. He was an old man, an old black janitor with a baked, stooped figure, always immersed in work, with fatigue, despair, and years of pain piercing his body. His face was marked with what accumulates in the lives of people when they become invisible to everyone around them, when they are not paid attention to, when they can no longer remain silent from pain, but continue to remain silent because they know that if they speak, no one will hear them. He stood quietly and watched as Maya, despite everything that was happening around her, continued to fight, as her restraint became her strength, her tenacity her only weapon. He knew that she had to be strong, that she couldn't give in. He had seen it before. He had seen how people like her, like him, tried to fight when the whole world was against them. He hadn't interfered. He knew that her path was her own, that she had to go through this alone, but his eyes couldn't hide the pain. He knew how it would all end. He had seen how the system worked, how it sharpened its teeth and devoured those who stood against it. He knew that her fight would cost her more than she realized, because for people like him, it was all too familiar. All those little humiliations, all those silent watches, standing in the corner and watching people mock, not realizing that his eyes were the only ones who saw it all, who understood. He knew she was an exception because her intelligence and tenacity did not allow her to sink to the level of those oppressed by this society. But he saw her, just like all those who came and went, trying to find their way in this world, and perhaps even forgetting that the color of their skin would always determine their place. He saw how hard each step was for her, how her inner resistance began to break, how her face became increasingly covered with invisible wrinkles, traces of pain, of what remains from the fight against a system that would never be on her side. He knew that her environment was not an accident, but the result of years of exploitation. He was a silent witness. He knew that this moment, the moment when Maya felt pain, when she realized that her place here was the result of years of trying to destroy people like her. He saw how her eyes met the eyes of the guards, how she tried to take control of the situation. But this was the moment when she would no longer be given a word. Her place had already been decided. He stood there, quiet, feeling every step she took, knowing that he couldn't intervene, that he couldn't help her. He was old, black, and had lost his power, had lost the ability to be heard. All he could do was keep cleaning and keep quiet and watch. But there was more pain in his eyes than in the eyes of all those who tried to control her, to judge her. He knew what it was like to be black in this place, to know that you couldn't break free of your chains, to know that to so many people you were just a cleaner, just a nobody, to be ignored, to be used, to be forgotten. He'd seen them try to clean the dirt off this floor, off this country, off this city, trying to look clean and good, but never noticing those who lay in their shadows. And Maya, in that moment, standing before them, was more than just a prosecutor. She was their only proof that change was still possible, that they couldn't just keep hiding this world from everyone. But he knew that for her, like him, the system simply wouldn't allow it. He'd heard people whispering around him, how they thought she should be grateful to be here at all. To them, she was nothing more than a strange exception they tried to understand but couldn't. He knew that to them, she was an outsider in their world, and she would never be accepted as an equal. He knew that the system didn't give people like Maya the right to be heard. He'd seen her pain, and he knew that her fight would cost her more than she realized. He'd been there for so many of these moments. He'd been the one standing in the corner, watching it all, not intervening, because he knew his voice would never be heard. But now, standing there, he could feel his gaze on her again. He'd seen her resilience, her incredible strength, but he also knew that it would all be destroyed, because Maya, like everyone else, couldn't win. He was silent. He always remained silent, because he knew that those who wanted to be heard would eventually be destroyed. He continued to clean. It was his place. He was just a cleaner. But his eyes saw everything that was happening, and everything they were trying to hide. The courtroom was beginning to wait. Every person in their place, lawyers, journalists, representatives of the parties, relatives, and of course, the judge himself. They all sat, peering into the empty passage leading into the room, trying to figure out where the prosecutor was. Why? She had not yet appeared. It was a moment when everyone knew that time was running out, but no one dared to say out loud that it was not that simple. In the corner of the room, by the door, stood the secretary, turning around every time the door opened slightly. He held a stack of documents in his hands, and his gaze was tense. Time dragged on, and his hands began to tremble nervously, as if he, and not the prosecutor, was responsible for this moment. A silence was beginning to fall inside the room, which was already beginning to weigh on everyone present. It was not just empty, it was heavy, like an unjustified delay, like an unpaid price for silence, and a look that no one dared to restrain. The judge, with his chair on his throne, did not move, only slightly lifting his glasses to look around the room to feel the tension that was growing. His face was calm, as if he was so used to these moments that for him it was just part of another performance. The judge knew that time was his ally, and that all this delay only added to the atmosphere of inevitability. And yet, when he looked up and said in a loud, slightly drawn-out voice, "The trial begins," the room became even quieter. This moment was what everyone was waiting for, what they had been avoiding for so long. But suddenly, from behind the threshold in the room, a quick step was heard, and the judge's assistant approached him, whispering something quietly, so that the others could not hear. But it was too late to hide her words. "The prosecutor is not here yet." Her voice rang out in the emptiness of the room, but it was enough for everyone to hear. It was like a reminder that everything that happens here has a price. The anticipation became unbearable again. A thin layer of doubt appeared on the faces of the people sitting in the courtroom. They all turned their gaze to the front door. Everyone in the courtroom began to look for Maya. Some of the lawyers sitting in the back rows were moving papers, looking at their watches. Someone cleared his throat, nervously squeezing a pencil in his hand. Everyone felt the tension growing, as if there was a hidden threat in the air. This moment could be the point where everything went wrong. The prosecutor is late. The prosecutor, someone they did not expect to see, who did not fit their image of the ideal lawyer, who did not fit into their ideas of what a prosecutor should look like, suddenly disappeared again. They could not understand her, and their bewilderment grew. Behind the door stood the secretary and several other assistants. They were talking, whispering, and one of them at that moment headed for the door to find her. The wait was dragging on, and a slight bustle began in the hall. The judge did not try to contain his irritation. He did not hide the fact that his patience was running out. "The trial must go on." His voice cut through the silence, but his words could not bring back the lost minutes. Everyone began to move around the hall. Some of them crossed his gaze, but no one dared to ask what happened to the prosecutor. They, in fact, were not here to worry about her. Maya was just a character in this performance, and her role remained outside the real influence. Her whole life, and the life of her people, was this performance that no one wanted to take seriously. Everyone was waiting for her, but no one knew how she would look at them when she entered this hall. Her waiting, her absence, created a gap that only reinforced the feeling that her place here was not entirely natural. that her role in this process should be crossed out. Her skin color, her voice, her confidence, all of this was beyond their perception. It was alien, absurd. At that moment, the secretary turned again to the judge's assistant, and she, catching his gaze, nodded. He walked into the corridor, confidently, and with a certain expression on his face, as if he already knew that he would encounter another picture. A picture in which he would again have to help the prosecutor when she was not quite in the right image. Breathing heavily, he opened the door and walked into the empty corridor. He knew that Maya had not yet arrived, but he should have seen her, should have understood that she would not back down. And so, he went back out, approaching his desk. He paused and said into the microphone, "The prosecutor is late. He will be a couple of minutes." Whispering began in the hall. They couldn't hide their expressions of displeasure. They couldn't hide what was obvious. Maya, as a black woman, should never have been a prosecutor. It was unnatural, abnormal to them. They tolerated her presence, but not without resentment. It was too difficult for them. It was too ridiculous. They didn't understand her, and Maya knew that every moment she wasn't in this room was proof that they were right, because they were right that she wasn't here, that her voice didn't matter, that she wasn't in this place. It was a silent affirmation that in their world, she had no right to be. And in that moment, Maya felt like every second she delayed was another variable in a game she had long been losing. But she knew she had no choice but to march forward, step by step, into this building where she had never been seen as an equal. The courtroom was filled with a buzz of whispers. People began to move, looking around, but not knowing what to make of this moment. Time dragged on, and the tension became such that it could be felt in the air, like a steel cable stretched to its breaking point. Every eye was directed toward the door, as if everyone in the room was waiting for the unspeakable, for something to happen. And then finally, when the judge called the hearing to begin again, the silence was broken. That moment when all that was left was silence, overwhelming and palpable. Suddenly, the secretary ran into the room. She was out of breath, her eyes full of confusion and anxiety. She had a piece of paper in her hand, and she was clutching it so tightly that its edges were beginning to curl. Her entire body was tense. She did not look at anyone, did not try to notice anyone in the room except the judge. There was panic in her eyes that couldn't be hidden, despite her best attempt to maintain an outward calm. She walked quickly and leaned toward the judge, whispering something in his ear. But her words were so loud that the entire courtroom heard them. The prosecutor was thrown out. The judge froze. He hadn't expected this turn of events, although, in fact, he had been prepared for anything. He slowly turned to the secretary, as if he had only just realized what had happened. His face paled slightly, but he quickly pulled himself together, as if he had no right to show emotion. He looked at the secretary, and his gaze was unbearably cold, not only because of what had happened, but also because he realized that none of this was an accident. It was part of a system. He knew that what was happening in the courtroom was the result of Maya having no right to be there. This was her place, where she was not wanted. "What?" The judge's words seemed to cut through the silence like a knife. He was stunned, but he made no attempt to hide it. He turned sharply to the bailiff, who stood near the door, looking as if he was about to vanish into thin air. The bailiff froze. He did not even move, did not try to explain, did not try to justify himself. All he could do was remain silent. His face turned pale, and he stood like a stone, unable to move. He knew perfectly well that his actions had not only led to the prosecutor's expulsion, but had also been an open violation. It had all become part of the game they loved so much, and he knew that if it had been another person in her place, this moment would have been a bigger scandal than they could afford. But now he stood with this weight on his shoulders. He felt how every glance at him, at his indecision, became part of his responsibility. He knew that it was he who had not allowed Maya to enter the hall. He was the one who carried out orders that came not from the law, but from prejudices that had become part of the system. The judge noticed his reaction. He saw that the bailiff still had not moved, and his face remained as if he had witnessed something irreparable, and his gaze was cold as ice. "What is happening?" the judge repeated, louder now, making it clear that he would not tolerate it any longer. The secretary, completely at a loss, stepped back and said, The prosecutor was not allowed through the entrance. He was thrown out because of her appearance. She did not fit the standard. The judge did not say a word. He only turned to the courtroom. There was something dissatisfied in his eyes, something he hid from everyone. His gaze was intense and meaningful. Everyone in the courtroom, from the lawyers to the journalists, was waiting for his reaction. Everything that happened here became for them just part of their daytime spectacle. They expected a scandal, expected something they couldn't hide. But there was none. The judge was silent. He was silent for a long time. His gaze slid over everyone in the room, and everyone there felt his assessment. The prosecutor was an important part of the trial, but the system knew that Maya wasn't there to serve the rules. She didn't fit. She wasn't that, and she couldn't be part of their world. The judge turned back to the bailiff and said in a hoarse voice, "What the hell were you doing anyway?" The bailiff swallowed. He was, after all, little more than a figurehead who made sure the rules were followed, and he knew that in that moment he was part of something much bigger than himself. He was the one who was not only part of Maya's humiliation, but also part of the system that allowed such things to happen. He might not have thought about it before, but now it felt like a personal defeat. And that mattered. "The prosecutor should have been here," he said tightly, looking away from everyone. He felt guilty, but he also knew that he could not change anything. This was not just a case, it was a system that forced him to act this way and not otherwise. At that moment, Maya's figure appeared from behind the door again. She stood as before, without any explanation, without any reaction to what was happening. But her gaze was sharp, determined. This was her moment, her step, her fight. All this time, they were trying to restrain her, but she did not retreat. She entered the room, and everyone stood up. Everyone turned their eyes to her. The judge was the one who had to decide how the session would continue. He could have intervened. He could have said something. But he was silent. His silence was what spoke the most. Maya stood in the center of this silence, and her figure was powerful and confident, despite all the humiliation she had experienced. Here she was again, and all this time, despite everything that was happening around her, she had not given up. The judge had not said a word. The bailiff still stood there, his face pale, and in that moment it became clear. Her presence, her struggle, all of this was much more important than any trial, than this entire system. Before we continue, let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you ever had moments in your life similar to what we're talking about? Your experiences and opinions are important to us. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. When Maya stood up, all eyes turned to her again. The silence in the courtroom was so thick that it seemed as if every step she took could tear it apart. She stood there, alone, a black woman surrounded by those who had always considered her unnecessary, unwanted. But her presence was no longer just an act, it was an assertion of her right to be there. Her voice cut through the silence, and her words hung in the air like a challenge. "I request that you enter into the record an attempt to obstruct justice based on racial discrimination." Her words were precise, clear, and everything in the courtroom froze. All eyes, all thoughts immediately turned to her. The judge, who a second ago had seemed strong and confident in his role, now looked confused. He did not know what to say. He sat with narrowed eyes, looking at her, as if trying to figure out exactly what he should do. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face became stony, and his gaze, puzzled. This moment was a test for everyone present, for each of them, for all those who had always stood on the other side of the barricades. His silence was something he had always known he could ignore, something she could not win. But she stood before him, giving him no room for doubt. She did not apologize, did not try to justify herself. She did not try to hide her intentions. All she did was claim her rights, declare that she was not here by chance. She was part of this process, part of this world, and no one, not even the judge, could deny it. There was a calmness on her face that was almost disconcerting to everyone around her. She did not tremble, did not lose confidence. She was solid, like the rock on which her path was now built. The judge finally cleared his throat, and his voice cut through the silence. "I don't think it matters. None of this is relevant." She looked at him, not knowing what he meant, but not looking away. There was a hidden fear in his eyes now. He knew that her words had become a fact that could not be ignored. All he could do was continue his performance, continue what he had started, but it was not so easy anymore. She was not just a black woman who had to please everyone. She was a prosecutor, and she had proven it. She did not ask for favors or consent, and her voice became more important than his words. Whispers began to be heard in the room. Someone whispered something about it being wrong, someone else, something else, but none of them dared to say it out loud, did not dare to intervene. Maya stood in silence, ignoring the whispers. She was not here to please. She was here to win, and in her eyes, there was only one thing: to make sure that her right to be here was recognized, so that no one could say anymore that she was here by mistake. Her words, her calm, her intentions, all of it was a powerful challenge to the system that was always trying to put her in her place. "Put it in the record," she repeated, emphasizing once again that she would not back down. And at that moment, despite the growing tension in the room, she felt her words begin to light a fire. This was not just a demand. This was a statement. She would not allow herself to be defeated. She would not allow herself to be excluded. The judge continued to sit silently, and at that moment, his eyes met the eyes of one of the lawyers sitting at the back of the room. The lawyer instantly turned away, unable to bear the gaze. The judge opened his mouth again, but the words did not come out, as if he could not find the right words. It was a moment of realization. He was not just a person who had to listen to her demands. He was the one who now realized that her voice was more important than anything that happened in this room. His entire authority was being called into question, and there was nothing he could do to change it. Maya's gaze remained firm. She would not waver. She was here to be an example to all those who believed that someone like her could not belong in this place, to those who thought that her place was somewhere beyond their sight, beyond their comfortable solutions. She stood, looking at the judge, and she knew that this was her moment. She was here to make this moment her victory. The judge finally spoke, but his voice was hushed, nervous. "This is inappropriate." And yet, again, he looked as if he were trying to regain control. He looked at her with a look that said he still believed in his right to dictate. But Maya stood, and her silence was the answer. She was not going to speak to him anymore. Everything had been said. And her victory was that she stood up again, despite everything they tried to do. She could have walked away. She could have given up again. But she didn't. And she didn't let them think that her place was anywhere outside of this process. In her eyes, there was only one thing. Her being here was a right. And no one could take that away. No one. Before we continue, let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you ever had moments in your life similar to what we're talking about? Your experiences and opinions are important to us. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. We continue. The judge, like everyone else in the courtroom, was silent, but his silence was no longer an expression of indifference. He knew that he couldn't continue like this. His gaze was focused. He was trying to collect himself, to try to find a solution, but his inner world was collapsing. This was not just a case. This was a moment when all his power and the power of the judicial system were under threat. He looked at the bailiffs, who were now standing, avoiding Maya's gaze. And they were all silent participants in this theatre. They were part of a system that was now turning into something much more sinister than just the random humiliation of one person. One of the bailiffs, the same one who did not let Maya into the building, could not stand it. His face turned pale, and it seemed that he did not know what to do. He did not know how to justify himself. He was silent for a long time, and then quietly said, as if making excuses, I didn't know. They told me that she could not get through because..." He did not have time to finish. His words were confused, as if he was still trying to understand what had happened. He himself was nothing more than a pawn in this game, but his words became unbearable for everyone who had witnessed the system crumble before their eyes. The lawyers sitting at the tables began to whisper among themselves. There was not only interest in their eyes, but also open surprise, how they could have been wrong, how they could not have noticed this before, how they could not have seen what was happening, how they did not notice that from the very beginning this was a game in which they simply did not want to see her. Some of them were already exchanging glances, and someone tried to turn around, but everyone stood tense, as if waiting for what would happen next. Against all this, the judge finally began to feel that he had lost control. He tried to maintain order, but like most of those present, he understood that in this moment there was a real threat, not for Maya, but for everything they believed to be right. And as he stood there, looking as if he was under several pressures at once, louder whispers began to be heard in the courtroom. How is this even possible? Is this even legal? Some of the lawyers were quietly discussing, barely aware that their words could be recorded. One of the reporters sitting in the front row couldn't help but pull out her phone. There was less interest in her eyes than a desire to capture this moment. She couldn't pass up this chance, a chance that was becoming more than just another trial. This was more. This was evidence of a system that was supposed to be fair crumbling under the pressure of the truth. Her fingers typed quickly, recording everything that was happening in that moment. And then she added a few more words. Racial discrimination in court. She knew that her publication would be more than just a story. It would be a sensation that would destroy everything. Some of the other reporters began to take pictures. These cameras captured the moment when the bailiff began to justify himself, when everyone began to understand what had been hidden from them. And although there was no open outrage on their faces, everyone realized that now everything would change. The scandal had already become part of this process, and perhaps even more than the process itself. Maya stood, but her body showed no fear. Her face remained firm, as if she had already been through this ordeal 1,000 times. This was not her first humiliation. This was not the first time she had encountered racism. But this moment was special because it was public. This moment was the moment when not only she stood up to the system, but the entire system was called into question. She did not look at the judge. She did not seek justification from those standing next to her. She simply remained in her place. And this gesture became much more important than words. This moment became more than a protest. It became her victory. When the bailiff finally looked up, his eyes met hers. It wasn't just silence. It was the realization that he could no longer make excuses, that his words had been part of what had exposed this system. His gaze was filled with shame and the knowledge that his actions had led to this moment. But he couldn't change anything. He knew that her presence here was the truth. He knew that his actions were a mistake, but he also knew that he was only part of what was happening in this room. And in that moment, as the camera clicked another frame, Maya didn't back down. She didn't turn back, didn't apologize for what she had done. She didn't hide her bitterness like others would have. She didn't bow like everyone who was there wanted her to. She remained standing, and it was her resilience, her determination, that broke all the masks. Those masks that hid the truth. Those masks that allowed people to think they couldn't see how this system worked. The masks fell. And that was her victory. That was her moment. And now, at this moment, everyone understood. Maya Johnson had become more than just a prosecutor. She had become a symbol. And this moment, which they had all tried to hide, was their defeat. It was the end. And with this end, a new stage was beginning. A stage where she would fight for her place. A stage where her voice would be heard, and no masks could muffle it. The courtroom filled with applause. But to Maya it sounded like blows to her chest. Blows that only emphasized the emptiness inside. She had won. She had won the case. But it was not a victory. It was a confirmation of her fearlessness, her determination to go through with it, despite all the humiliations, despite what the system had tried to do to her. She had won, but her victory left her empty, because she knew that in this system there were no winners. The system she had worked so hard to defend had shown its face again. It was a face that was not only contemptuous, it was hypocritical, a face that hid everything that was really going on. The judge, sitting in his seat, showed no joy, no regret. He simply sat there, as always, looking at her with eyes full of emptiness, and she knew that there was no respect in his eyes, no recognition of her merits. It was just a formality, a moment when a decision was made, but nothing more. A face that could never understand her. All she could feel was another loneliness in this huge system that never thought about people like her. She stood up and gathered her things. The folders with documents that meant so much to her became just a weight. She felt her body tighten with fatigue. She did not feel a victory. She felt only the weight of what had been done. She knew that this was not just a matter. This was her challenge. This was a challenge to the system. And even if she won, she felt that the system had won too. She had gone through all the pain and humiliation, through all those moments when she felt that she was not accepted, that she was not acknowledged, that she was wanted to be seen simply as an element that needed to be put in her place. But even though she had won, these feelings remained. And even this applause, which she knew was not sincere, could not overshadow this bitterness. She walked towards the exit, and her steps sounded hollow, as if they were the steps of a person who no longer believed in this system, who realized that the fight she had waged was in vain. It was not only her loneliness, it was the loneliness of everyone who had ever stood in her position, who had ever tried to fight for the truth but had been deceived by this system. As she approached the exit, she felt the eyes following her. Everyone in this room did not look at her as a winner. They looked at her as a strange exception, as someone who did not fit into their ideal world, as someone who, despite everything, remained standing, although everything was against him. These were not looks filled with admiration. These were the looks of those who now understood that Maya, despite everything she had achieved, could not be part of their world. They could not accept her. They couldn't accept that she, a black woman, had done this. At that moment, as Maya walked out of the courthouse, she felt her body being pulled down. Every move she made was now tied to that feeling. She walked in silence, keeping her head down, although everyone around her could see that she hadn't lowered it from shame. She hadn't lowered it from the fact that the system had shown its true face again. And although she had won, she felt that there was no room in this courtroom for her victory. The judge hadn't said a word to her. All those people who sat here hadn't said a single word to her. Everything was hidden behind the mask of justice, behind the mask of order. But in reality, it was just hypocrisy that would never cease to exist. She walked out of the courtroom, and her steps echoed in the empty hallway. Her every move was tied to her heavy breathing, to that deafening feeling that she hadn't gotten what she truly deserved. Her victory was bitter because she knew that she had not defeated the system. She had not defeated them. She had defeated their rules, but the system itself remained intact. She was part of this process, but the system always found a way to snatch the victory from her hands until she was simply part of its struggle. She heard footsteps behind her. She did not look back, but she felt her whole body filling with heaviness. At that moment, she already knew that the victory was only an appearance. She was not part of their world. And despite everything she had done, everything remained as it was. She was not one of them. She could not be. She was a winner, but no one saw her real victory. In their eyes, she was nothing more than someone who had once been rejected by the system. She went outside. Outside, the rain did not stop. It was the same as before. Grey, cold, endless. It did not stop, and it was like a symbol of the fact that despite all her efforts, her victory could not change the world. She wasn't part of it. She was an exception, an accident. It was excruciating. Maya walked down the street, not feeling a victory, not feeling joy. All she felt was emptiness. But she knew one thing. This emptiness, this bitterness, was part of her. It was her own reminder that victories are bitter, and the world never changes unless the system wants it to. What do you think about this story? Have you had any moments in your life related to racism that left a mark? It is very important for us to hear your thoughts and experiences. Each of you is incredibly important to us, and we truly appreciate everyone who supports and reads our stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it if you enjoyed it. Write in the comments the phrase, the story is finished. This way we will know that you got to the end. We wish you a good day and hope to see you again.